This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Across 2,000 years of Indian history, one name echoes above all others: Vikramaditya, the son of valor. But who was he? A legendary king? A title claimed by many? Or a magnificent cultural invention? In this narration, we'll trace his story from the contested historical record to the battlefield, from a ghost-haunted cremation ground to a throne guarded by celestial beings, and from ancient Ujjain to a modern aircraft carrier. Prepare to explore one of history's most enduring mysteries, a man who may never have existed, yet shaped an entire civilization. Chapter 1: One Man, Many Kings, or Pure Myth. There is a name in Indian history that has traveled across 2,000 years, crossing the boundaries of language, religion, dynasty, and geography, appearing in stories from the mountains of Kashmir to the shores of Tamil Nadu. That name is Vikramaditya. It means, quite literally, the son of valor. In Sanskrit, Vikrama means valor or prowess, and Aditya refers to the sun, one of the most powerful and enduring symbols in Hindu cosmology. Together, they form a name that announces something extraordinary before a single story has been told. But here is where the mystery begins. Vikramaditya is everywhere in Indian literature, folklore, and tradition, and yet the man himself is almost nowhere in the historical record. When historians look for him in the places where kings leave their marks, on coins, on stone pillars, in royal genealogies, they find something both fascinating and troubling. They find not one Vikramaditya, but many. And they find that the earliest reliable evidence for a king by this name appears not in the 1st century before the Common Era, when popular tradition places him, but centuries later, buried in literary and religious texts that themselves raise as many questions as they answer. This is the central enigma. Was Vikramaditya one singular man who ruled from the ancient city of Ujjain, who defeated foreign invaders and established a calendar still in use today? Was he a title, a standard of kingship, adopted by many rulers across many centuries? Or is he, at his core, a magnificent fiction, a cultural invention that India needed and so created? The answer, as with so many things in ancient Indian history, is layered and complicated, and the layers themselves tell a story. Start with the earliest references. The first work that may have mentioned Vikramaditya was an Indian epic called the Brihat Katha, composed somewhere between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE in a language called Paisachi, which survives only in fragments and adaptations. The original text is lost. Its mention of Vikramaditya is known only through later works, adaptations produced in the 6th century and beyond, which scholars suspect may contain additions and embellishments that were not in the original. Even the oldest traceable source is filtered through centuries of retelling. There is also a collection of poems attributed to the Satavahana king Hala, who ruled around the 1st century of the Common Era. One verse mentions a king named Vikramaditya, who gave away his wealth in acts of extraordinary generosity. This sounds like confirmation. But scholars who have examined the text carefully point out that many of its stanzas appear to be later insertions from the Gupta period, roughly the 4th and 5th century CE, and that the verse about Vikramaditya closely echoes language found in Gupta royal inscriptions. The resemblance is strong enough that the verse may itself be a Gupta-era addition placed into a much older text. The first uncontested, unambiguous mentions of Vikramaditya appear in 6th century works. The Buddhist scholar Paramartha, writing between 499 and 569 CE, quotes a legend describing a king named Vikramaditya whose capital was Ayodhya, not Ujjain. In this story, the king gave 300,000 gold coins to a Samkhya philosopher for defeating a Buddhist teacher in a debate, and then gave an equal sum to the Buddhist scholar Vasubandhu for arguing the other side effectively. The Chinese traveler Xuanzang, writing in the 7th century, places Vikramaditya as the king of Shravasti and describes him as so proud of his generosity that when a Buddhist monk gave a barber 100,000 gold coins simply for a shave, the king was embarrassed and retaliated by humiliating the monk in a public debate. These 6th and 7th century accounts present Vikramaditya as a figure already remembered, already famous, a glorious memory of the past, as the 6th century writer Subandhu described him. This is not the language used for a contemporary. It is the language used for a legend, for someone who existed at a remove, whose story had already been polished and adorned through telling and retelling. So what does the historical record actually show? There is no inscription, no coin, no royal genealogy in the Puranas that places a king named Vikramaditya on the throne of Ujjain in the 1st century BCE. The Puranas record the lineages of many significant kingdoms from this period: the Shungas, the Kanvas, the Satavahanas, the Shakas. They do not name a Vikramaditya ruling from Ujjain around 57 BCE. The political landscape of that era was crowded and complex, and for a figure as powerful as the legendary Vikramaditya is said to have been, a monarch who defeated all foreign invaders, whose empire stretched from the Indus to Rameshwaram, his total absence from the archaeological and epigraphic record is striking. The calendar attributed to his victory only deepens this puzzle, and that evidence deserves its own careful examination. This brings us to the most historically grounded candidate for who Vikramaditya might actually have been: the Gupta emperor Chandragupta II, who ruled from approximately 375 to 415 CE. He bore the title Vikramaditya, attested on coins and in the Supia pillar inscription, defeated the Shaka rulers of western India, and made Ujjain a center of cultural and intellectual life. Many historians, including D.C. Surkar, D.R. Bhandarkar, and V.V. Mirashi, have argued that Chandragupta II is the historical core around which the Vikramaditya legend crystallized. His defeat of the Shakas, his association with Ujjain, his patronage of scholars and poets, his deliberate adoption of the title, all align with the broad outlines of the legendary figure. Even the story of how he came to power carries a mythic quality. A Sanskrit play called Devi Chandraguptam, composed roughly 2 centuries after his reign, describes how he disguised himself as his brother's queen, entered a Shaka enemy's camp, killed the king, and returned in triumph before eventually claiming the throne. Whether historical or invented, the account has the structure of heroic myth, attaching itself to a figure whose existence is otherwise documented in stone and metal. But Chandragupta II is not the only candidate. Some historians, drawing on early Jain sources, argue for an earlier, real Malava king who genuinely defeated the Shakas in the 1st century BCE and initiated the calendar era. Malava Republican coins discovered at sites associated with ancient Ujjain bear a Brahmi inscription about the victory of the Malava Republic, suggesting a real political entity capable of such a campaign. No coin or inscription, however, names Vikramaditya personally as its leader. A third theory connects the legend to the 6th century Alakara king Yashodharman, who defeated the Hunas, a different foreign power, and whose dynasty used the Malava-era calendar in their inscriptions. Max Mueller was among those who favored this identification. But Yashodharman's capital was at Mandsaur, not Ujjain, and he fought the Hunas rather than the Shakas, a significant problem for connecting him to legends that consistently name the Shakas as the enemy. What emerges from all of this is a picture not of one man, but of a process. The Vikramaditya legend appears to be what happens when a culture creates a composite hero, taking the valor of one king, the scholarship of another's court, the military achievements of a third, and the cultural patronage of a fourth, and fusing them into a single luminous figure who embodies everything a perfect king should be. The Gupta model of kingship, which combined martial excellence with intellectual patronage and divine association, became the template. After the Gupta Empire began to decline in the 6th century, regional kingdoms and storytellers picked up this template and poured it into the mold of Vikramaditya, a figure who could carry all of these values at once. This explains why the legend is so remarkably fluid. In the 11th century Kathasarit Sagara of Somadeva, one of the great literary compendia of medieval India, Vikramaditya's capital is sometimes Pataliputra and sometimes Pratishtana, not Ujjain. His rival is sometimes a king named Narasimha, sometimes Shalivahana. In Jain literature, he is sometimes the enemy of Jainism, sometimes its champion. In Buddhist accounts, he is generous to Buddhist scholars in one breath and hostile to them in another. He is described as the son of a king named Mahendraditya in some sources and as the son of Gandharvasena in others. Each tradition, each community, each dynasty shaped him to fit their own needs. Sir Richard Burton, who first translated many of these tales into English, called Vikramaditya the King Arthur of the East, and the comparison is instructive. Arthur, too, is a figure who may have a historical kernel, a Romano-British war leader perhaps, but who became a vessel into which centuries of cultural aspiration were poured. What matters about Arthur is not whether he pulled a sword from a stone, but what that image says about the values a culture holds dear. The same is true of Vikramaditya. Whether or not a single man with that name defeated the Shakas in 57 BCE, the stories told about him across 2,000 years speak to something deep in the Indian imagination about what a king should be, what wisdom looks like in action, and what it means to carry the burden of justice. What is particularly striking is how quickly the question of his identity dissolved in the face of his usefulness. Once the Vikramaditya legend was established, everyone wanted a piece of it. Buddhist legends claimed him. Jain traditions debated him fiercely. The Bhavishya Purana places Vikramaditya as a divine instrument of Shiva, sent to earth to restore righteousness. Tamil legends gave him 32 divine marks on his body, the characteristic signs of a universal emperor. The question of who he was, one man, a title, a composite figure, or a cultural dream, may never be fully resolved. But the persistence of the argument is itself telling. A culture does not argue across 2,000 years about whether a legend is real unless that legend is doing real work. And for the Vikramaditya legend, that work began with a single foundational act, the expulsion of a foreign people who had seized the land and shattered its order. It is that act, real or mythologized, early or late, that gave the legend its starting point, its calendar, its year zero, and its claim on every generation that came after. Chapter 2. Triumph over the Shakas, Birth of an Era. To understand why Vikramaditya matters so deeply to Indian cultural memory, you have to understand what the Shakas were and what their presence on Indian soil meant to the people who lived beneath their rule. Because the story of Vikramaditya's most celebrated act, his expulsion of these invaders, and his establishment of the calendar era that still governs festivals, weddings, and sacred observances across the subcontinent, is not simply a military story. It is a story about what a people choose to remember, and how a moment of liberation, real or imagined, becomes the fixed point around which an entire civilization orients itself in time. The Shakas were part of a broader wave of Central Asian nomadic peoples who had been pressing southward and eastward for centuries. Descended from the Indo-Scythian tribes that originated in the grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian, they had migrated through Bactria and the mountain passes of the northwest, eventually establishing control over significant portions of the Indian subcontinent. By the 1st century before the Common Era, they were a settled and sometimes sophisticated power in western India, ruling from Sindh and making determined inroads into Malwa, the fertile plateau region whose most important city was Ujjain. They were not simply raiders. They struck coins, built cities, patronized art, and even, over time, began to absorb elements of the culture they had conquered.
But to the people of Avanti, Malwa, and the surrounding regions, they remained outsiders, mlekchas, as the Sanskrit tradition called them, foreigners who did not speak the sacred languages, who did not observe the sacred rites, and whose presence on Indian soil was experienced as a profound disruption of the natural and moral order.
The oldest and most vivid account of how Vikramaditya drove these invaders out comes not from a Hindu text, but from the Jain tradition, in a work known as the Kalakacharya Kathanaka. Its telling is remarkably specific, and it begins not with Vikramaditya at all, but with his father, and with an act of outrage that set an entire sequence of events in motion. According to this account, the king of Ujjain at the time was Gardabila, a powerful man, but one who would become a cautionary example of power misused. Gardabila abducted Saraswati, the sister of a revered Jain acharya named Kalaka. The monk's appeals for her release were refused. Gardabila was a king, and in his own estimation, his will was the final word within his kingdom. He had miscalculated. Kalaka, burning with righteous fury, traveled beyond the Indus to the territory of the Shaka chiefs, powerful rulers in what the texts call Sakastana, and persuaded them to march on Ujjain. What followed, according to the Kalakacharya account, was a rout. With the assistance of what the text characterizes as miraculous intervention, the Shakas defeated Gardabila, made him their prisoner, and seized control of Ujjain. Saraswati was freed. Gardabila, stripped of his throne and his dignity, was eventually released, retired to the forest, and was killed there by a tiger. This detail, the tiger in the forest, is the kind of specific, unheroic, almost mundane ending that has the feel of genuine folk memory. The Grand King, defeated not by a rival monarch, but by his own arrogance and by the tiger's indifference to royal lineage, dies in the wilderness, far from his throne. His young son, Vikramaditya, is left to grow up in the shadow of that defeat.
In the Kalakacharya account, Vikramaditya did not begin his resistance from Ujjain. He had to start from Pratishtana, far to the south in the Deccan, building his strength, gathering his forces, preparing a campaign that would eventually carry him back to the city from which his family had been displaced. When he finally moved, he moved decisively. He drove the Shakas from Ujjain. He pushed them further and further from Indian soil. Some traditions say he chased them all the way to Bactria, the Central Asian region that is present-day Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, reaching the very edges of the world as ancient Indians understood it. To commemorate this victory, to mark in time the moment when the foreigners were expelled and the natural order restored, he established an era. That era began in 57 BCE. It would eventually be called the Vikrama Samvat.
Other accounts of the battle fill in different details. The Kathasarit describes Vikramaditya assembling a remarkable coalition before his campaign against the Mlekchas. Kings came to his standard from across the subcontinent. Shakti Kumara from Gauda in Bengal, Jayadvaja from Karnata in the south, Vijayavarman from Lata in Gujarat, Sunandana from Kashmir in the north, Gopal from Sindh. The very geography of this alliance, east, south, west, north, was a statement about Vikramaditya's claim to be not merely a regional king, but a pan-Indian empire, the rallying point for a civilization asserting itself against outside domination. His general Vikrama Shakti, according to these same accounts, went on to defeat not only the Shakas, but a broad range of foreign groups. Kambojas, Yavanas, Hunas, Barbaras, Tusharas, and Persians, as if the expulsion of one group had unleashed a campaign of civilizational restoration.
The Persian scholar al-Biruni, who visited India in the early 11th century and wrote one of the most penetrating accounts of Indian thought and culture ever composed by an outsider, recorded the legend he learned about the establishment of the Shaka era. And his account is illuminating precisely because it confuses two eras, and in doing so reveals how complicated the historical memory had already become by his time. Al-Biruni learned that Indians used 5 calendar eras, including one attributed to Vikramaditya beginning in 57 BCE, and one associated with the Shakas beginning in 78 CE. When he tried to understand how both eras could be connected to the same conflict, he was told a legend. A Shaka ruler had invaded northwestern India and oppressed its people. Vikramaditya had defeated and killed him in the region between Multan and a castle called Loni. The astronomers of that day had then used the date of this victory to begin a new era. Al-Biruni concluded sensibly that since there were 135 years between the two eras, they must have been established by 2 different kings who bore the same name. His confusion was understandable. The history had already become densely layered by his time, different traditions claiming the same events in different combinations.
What is historically verifiable is this. A calendar era beginning in 57 BCE was in use in central India from at least the 3rd century of the Common Era, and probably earlier. The earliest datable inscriptions that count their years from this starting point are the Yupa inscriptions, ritual pillar inscriptions from Rajasthan dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. These inscriptions do not call the era Vikramasamvat. They call it the Krita era. Later inscriptions from the 5th century onward sometimes refer to it as the Malava era, named for the Malava people, the tribal group long associated with the Ujjain region. The Mansoor stone inscription, which dates to roughly the 5th century and was issued during the time of Yashodharman, uses both names together, as if the scribes themselves were aware that the era was known by more than one designation. The transition from Krita or Malava era to Vikramasamvad was not a sudden declaration, but a slow cultural drift. Inscriptions using the name Vikrama era begin appearing only from the 9th century onward. The Ahara inscription of the king Alata, dated to Vikrama year 810, is among the earliest clear examples. By this point, the Paramara dynasty had established itself as the ruling power in Malva and Ujjain, and the Paramaras were deeply invested in associating themselves with Vikramaditya's legacy. They claimed descent from him, or at least from his dynasty, and by calling their calendar era after him, they were doing what ruling families have always done, borrowing the prestige of a celebrated predecessor to legitimize their own authority. The era's name became fixed around the same time that the Vikramaditya legends were crystallizing in literary texts.
The calendar itself, whatever name it bore in any given century, is a remarkable piece of practical and cultural engineering. It is what scholars call a lunisolar calendar, a system that attempts to reconcile the rhythms of the moon with the rhythms of the sun, both of which matter for agricultural and ritual purposes. It uses 12 lunar months, but it aligns them with the solar year of approximately 365 days by inserting an extra month, called Adhika Masa, the surplus month, roughly every 2.5 to 3 years, a mechanism similar in principle to the Gregorian leap year, though far more complex in its astronomical calculations. The movements of planets, constellations, and the zodiac signs are all factored into its workings. This makes it simultaneously practical for farming, where the seasons matter, and sacred for ritual, where the positions of celestial bodies determine auspicious moments. The new year in the Vikram Samvat begins on the first day, Pratipada, of the bright half of the month of Chaitra, which falls in March or April of the Gregorian calendar. This day, known as Chaitra Shukladi, is one of the great turning points of the Indian ritual year. In Maharashtra, it is celebrated as Gudi Padwa, when homes are decorated and a decorated pole is raised to welcome the new year. In South India, it is called Ugadi, observed with similar festivities marking renewal and hope. The symbolism of a new beginning, tied to the spring season, to the lengthening of days, and the awakening of the earth after winter, gives the calendar its emotional and cultural resonance. It is not merely a system for counting days. It is a way of locating human life within the rhythms of the cosmos.
What made the Vikram Samvat culturally durable was not just its technical structure, but its breadth of adoption.
Hindus have used it for generations to determine the timing of festivals, to select auspicious dates for marriages and housewarmings, to begin new businesses, or mark the deaths of loved ones. Sikhs have drawn on it as well. Jain communities have their own calendar traditions, but share elements with this broader lunisolar framework. In Nepal, where the calendar is known as Bikram Sambat, it was adopted as the official state calendar in 1901 and remains so today, running 57 years ahead of the Gregorian calendar, which means that as the Gregorian world counted out the year 2024, Bikram Sambat was marking the year 2081. This is not a relic. It is a living system, printed on legal documents and school calendars, shaping the rhythms of daily life in a sovereign nation of 30 million people. The connection between the military victory and the calendar is, in every tradition, precisely the point. When Vikramaditya established his era, he was not simply adopting a convenient administrative tool. He was declaring that time itself had been reset. The Shaka occupation was not merely a political inconvenience to be corrected, it was a rupture in the cosmic order, a period when wrong prevailed and right was pushed to the margins. The defeat of the Shakas was therefore not simply a military triumph, it was a restoration. And a restoration of that magnitude deserved its own beginning point in time, its own year zero from which all subsequent years would be counted. Every festival observed in Vikram Samvat, every auspicious date selected by its calculations, every legal document stamped with its year, carries within it, embedded in its very structure, the memory of that moment when a king drove out the foreigners and declared that the natural order had been restored. This is the lasting power of the calendar as a cultural artifact. It makes the victory eternal. Not in the sense that it prevents future invasions or guarantees permanent political stability, but in the sense that it inscribes a moment of liberation permanently into the structure of time itself. No matter what dynasty rules Ujjain, no matter what empire rises or falls, every year that passes in the Vikram Samvat carries the number of years that have elapsed since the Shakas were driven out. The victory is not remembered, it is counted. And that is a different, more intimate kind of memory altogether.
Which raises a question that the calendar itself cannot answer. If the defeat of the Shakas was this momentous, and the calendar that commemorated it spread this widely and endured this long, why did that calendar wait 900 years before being formally named after the king who supposedly started it? What happened in those 9 centuries between the event and the naming? And what does the court that gathered around Vikramaditya after his victory, that legendary assembly of 9 extraordinary minds, tell us about what kind of ruler he was imagined to be?
Chapter 3. The Court That Memory Built. If the defeat of the Shakas established Vikramaditya as a warrior, it was his court that made him immortal, because the most enduring image of Vikramaditya is not a man on a battlefield, sword in hand, driving foreign invaders toward the horizon. It is a man on a throne, surrounded by the finest minds of his age, listening to poetry, debating philosophy, weighing the movements of celestial bodies, and always asking, questions that illuminate the nature of justice, beauty, and human conduct. The legends gave him a military victory to mark time by, but they gave him the Navaratnas to define what that time was worth. Navaratna means literally 9 gems. The word itself is sensuous and deliberate, not 9 ministers, not 9 advisors, not 9 functionaries of state. 9 gems. The language implies that these men were not tools of governance, but treasures, objects of beauty and rarity that a king of extraordinary discernment had gathered and polished into their best and brightest form. The image of an ideal court in the Indian tradition was not a place of bureaucratic efficiency, but a place of luminous intellectual life, where the arts and sciences flowered under royal protection, and where the king himself was measured by the quality of the minds he attracted and sustained.
The traditional list of the 9 scholars in Vikramaditya's court, as it has come down through the centuries, includes Kalidasa, Dhanvantari, Kshapanaka, Amarasimha, Shanku, Vitalabhata, Gatakarpara, Varahamihira, and Vararuchi. The verse that names them is embedded in a Sanskrit astrological treatise called the Jyotirvidabarana, attributed to Kalidasa himself.
Dhanvantarik Shapanako Marasinghaha Sankuvetala Bhatta Ghatakara Parakalidasaha Khyato Varaha Mihiro N.R. Patesa Sabham Ratnanivai Vararuchir Nava Vikramasya. This single verse, embedded in a text whose own dating is disputed, is the primary literary evidence for the canonical list. The very composition of the 9 shifts depending on who is telling the story. Harisena sometimes appears where Ghatakarpara stands, Vararuchi in other tellings displacing someone else, which is itself evidence that the list was an ideal being assembled, not a roster being transcribed. It is an extraordinary image. It is also, almost certainly, a later construction.
The uncomfortable truth is that historians who have examined the Jyotirvidabarana carefully have concluded that it could not have been written by Kalidasa. V.V. Mirashi, who placed the text in the 12th century, pointed to grammatical errors that Kalidasa, whose command of Sanskrit was, by universal agreement, impeccable, would never have made. D.C. Sirkar, one of the most rigorous epigraphists of modern India, dismissed the Jyotirvidabarana as worthless for historical purposes. And the deeper problem is simply chronological. The scholars named as Navaratnas did not live at the same time. Vararuchi appears to have flourished in the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. Kalidasa is most reliably placed in the 5th century. Varahimira recorded his own birth in Kali year 3042, a date that, calculated against one era, the Yudhishthira Shaka of 3102 BCE, yields approximately 95 BCE, but against the Shalivahana Shaka yields approximately 499 CE. The contradiction is not an error, it is a window into how contested the very calendar of ancient India remains. Amarasimha compiled his famous lexicon using the earlier works of both Dhanvantari and Kalidasa, which means he could not have been their contemporary. The 9 gems, separated from each other by decades or even centuries, could not all have sat in the same court at the same time. And yet, to dismiss the Navaratnas as pure invention is to miss what the legend is actually doing. It is, in the terms this article has already introduced, aspirational history, and nowhere is that clearer than in the Navaratnas, which are not a historical record of a single court, but a cultural statement about what a great court should contain.
The one exception to this skepticism is Kalidasa. He is the only figure among the Navaratnas whose connection to Vikramaditya is mentioned in texts that predate the Jyotirvidabarana. The 10th century scholar Raja Sekara, writing on the nature and practice of poetry, recorded that Vikramaditya had sent Kalidasa as his personal ambassador to the king of the Kuntala country, the region corresponding to present-day Uttara Kannada on the southwestern coast of India. The 11th century polymath King Bhoja of Dara made a similar reference, as did Kshemendra in his own 11th century literary criticism. These are independent witnesses, separated by geography and institutional affiliation, all pointing to the same association. Whether Kalidasa genuinely served as an ambassador, or whether his deep identification with the Vikramaditya ideal simply made later writers imagine him in that role, cannot be determined with certainty. But the persistence of the connection across multiple independent sources across multiple centuries is significant.
What is not disputed is the magnitude of what Kalidasa produced. His play Abhijana Shakuntalam tells the story of a king who falls in love with a forest girl, marries her in secret, and then, cursed to forget her, dismisses her when she comes to his court. The German poet Goethe, encountering the play in the 18th century, wrote that it contained simultaneously the flowers of spring and the fruits of autumn, the joys of earth and the delights of heaven. His epic poem, Meghaduta, tells the story of a yaksha exiled from his mountain home who asks a cloud to carry his message of longing to his wife. Its Sanskrit-evoking landscape and desire with an intimacy unmatched in any language. To attribute all of this to the court of Vikramaditya was to say something powerful. This is what royal patronage can produce when a king understands that poetry is not ornamentation but sustenance. There is, moreover, a strand of tradition that complicates the framing of Vikramaditya as purely the audience for his scholars' achievements. An 8th century text records that Chandragupta II, Vikramaditya himself, composed 2 poetic works, the Tripurusha Charita and the Supurusha Charita, under the name Devagupta. If the attribution has any substance, the king was not only the patron of the 9 gems, but something like a 10th. Not merely the occasion for creative work, but a participant in it.
Varahamihira's connection to the court carries its own remarkable texture. His Brihat Samhita is an encyclopedic work ranging across astronomy, astrology, meteorology, architecture, geography, and natural history, a compendium of the observable world as the 6th century understood it. His Panchasiddhantika summarizes the 5 major astronomical systems of his time, comparing and evaluating different methods for calculating celestial positions and calendar dates.
One tradition gives Varamihira an unusual narrative role in the legend. He is said to have predicted the death of the king's own son, calculating from the positions of the planets that the prince would die on a specific date from a boar's tusk. The court took every precaution imaginable. The prince was confined to a fortified chamber. All sharp instruments were removed. Guards were posted at every entrance. No animal capable of harm could reach him. But on the appointed day, a decorative boar carved into the stonework of the chamber's architecture worked loose from its mounting and fell. Its carved tusk struck the prince's skull and killed him exactly as the astronomer had said it would. The king came to Varamihira not in gratitude, but in grief, perhaps in reproach. The prediction had been believed, the precautions had been taken, and the precautions had not mattered. Varamihira could only explain that he had read what was written in the heavens. He had not written it. A king who absorbs that answer, who keeps the astronomer in his court even when the astronomer's truth is unbearable, is a king who has placed something above comfort. That, the legend suggests, is the actual condition of genuine intellectual patronage. Not the celebration of knowledge when knowledge pleases, but the tolerance of knowledge when knowledge wounds.
Dhanvantari occupies a different but equally significant space in the Navaratna tradition. The name itself is ancient. Dhanvantari is the divine physician of Hindu mythology, the figure who emerged from the churning of the cosmic ocean bearing a pot of Amrita, the nectar of immortality. When tradition assigns a Dhanvantari to Vikramaditya's court, it is layering the mortal physician onto the divine archetype, suggesting that the king's court physician was so skilled that he partook of that primordial healing power. Historically, there was an author by this name who compiled a medical glossary cataloging medicinal plants, their properties, and their uses. The inclusion of a physician in the 9 gems says something clear about what kind of completeness the ideal court required. Governance and healing belong together, and a king who does not tend to the physical well-being of his subjects through the best medical knowledge available to him is not a complete king.
Amarasimha's contribution was of a different order entirely, and in some ways the most foundational contribution in the list. His Amarakosha, literally the treasury of Amara, is a Sanskrit thesaurus, a systematic lexicon that organizes words by category: the divine, the celestial, the earthly, the human body, grammar, and so on. For a civilization whose sacred texts were composed in Sanskrit and whose literary tradition depended on precise command of that language, a tool for understanding and deploying the full richness of the vocabulary was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. Kalidasa cannot write what he writes without the vocabulary that Amarasimha catalogues.
The astronomer cannot publish his findings in a form that students across the subcontinent can absorb without the shared terminological scaffolding the lexicon provides. The physician's plant names mean nothing unless they can be transmitted across generations in a stable and agreed-upon language. In this sense, Amarasimha may be the most indispensable figure in the list, not one of 9 equal peaks, but the base layer on which several of the others rest. That a lexicographer ranks among the 9 gems tells you that the court of Vikramaditya was imagined not merely as a gathering of artists and scientists, but as a place committed to the tools of thought itself. The Amarakosha became a foundational text in Sanskrit education across the subcontinent, memorized by students for centuries, its verses serving as mnemonic devices for acquiring vocabulary. This is what a great court produces that outlasts every court, not only poems and discoveries, but the shared language in which the next generation will produce their own.
Vitalabhata, whose name literally means the priest of the Vitala, the ghost spirit at the center of Vikramaditya's most famous legends, is described as a Magha Brahmin who composed 16 stanzas in praise of the king, a work called the Niti Pradipa, the lamp of conduct. His presence in the court captures something essential about what the Navaratna tradition was doing culturally. The king was not merely the beneficiary of scholarship. He was its occasion. Learning gathered around him because he created the conditions in which learning could thrive. And in return, the scholars articulated the principles by which he should rule. Shanku's role in the 9 gems is the least mythologized and perhaps the most practically significant. He is described as an architect and surveyor associated with the instrument called the Shanku, the gnomon used in astronomical observation to measure shadows and thereby determine time and direction. The connection between astronomical observation and land measurement, between the heavens and the governance of earthly territory, was deeply embedded in the Indian intellectual tradition. Shanku's portfolio, revenue records, administrative texts, reflects a court that understood knowledge to be as much practical as poetic. Among the 9, Kshapanaka stands as a figure of pointed interest for what his contested identity reveals. The competition to be included in the legend extended even to the list itself. Some Jain writers identified Siddhasena Devakara, a revered Jain philosopher of the 6th century, as Kshapanaka, a claim historians have not accepted, but which illustrates how communities across traditions wanted their own scholars to have stood in Vikramaditya's court. The Navaratna list was not simply being read, it was being argued over, which is itself evidence of how much it mattered who was on it. When you look closely at what the Jyotirvidibharana actually describes, the 9 gems turn out to be the visible apex of something much larger. According to that text, the court contained not just 9 special figures, but 16 great scholars, 16 astrologers, 16 physicians, 16 bhattas, and 16 scholars of Vedic learning. A vast intellectual establishment, with 800 vassal kings paying court to a monarch whose throne was illuminated by learning. Among the 16 great scholars named are Sanku, Vararuchi, Mani, Angudatta, Jishnu, Trilochana, Hari, who bore the title Dharmadhyaksha, supervisor of Dharma, under Vikramaditya, Gatakarpara, Amarasimha, Satyacharya, Varahamihira, Shrutasena, Badarayana, Manitta, Kumarasimha, and Kalidasa. The 9 gems are not a complete census of brilliance. They are the names that survived memory's compression. Vitalabhata is credited in this same text with guiding a comprehensive revision and updating of the Puranas, those vast narrative encyclopedias of Hindu cosmology, mythology, and history, making Ujjain the site of a civilizational literary reorganization. The court is described not as a gathering of individuals, but as the central sun of a solar system of knowledge, drawing scholars from across the subcontinent to orbit around the king. The 9 gems illuminate one dimension of the ideal king. The king as nourisher of learning, patron of the scholars who map the stars and catalog the words and chart the movements of the planets. But a different body of stories tests a different dimension entirely. What the king does not in his court, surrounded by brilliant minds and sustained by their work, but alone in the dark, carrying a corpse on his back, listening to riddles from a ghost, and discovering that wisdom is not something you acquire once and keep. It is something you must prove again and again in the most uncomfortable circumstances imaginable.
Chapter 4. The Ghost's Riddle and the Throne's Secret.
Picture the scene. It is night in the cremation ground at the edge of the city. The smoke of funeral pyres has died down, but the smell of ash and burnt offerings still hangs in the air. A king walks alone through this landscape of endings, carrying no weapon, no retinue, no torch. He has promised to bring back a creature, a Vitala, a spirit of the kind that inhabits and animates dead bodies, from a tree somewhere in the darkness ahead. A tantric, a practitioner of esoteric religious rites, has enlisted him for this task, and the king has agreed, because the king always honors his word. He finds the body hanging from a tree. He takes it down and flings it over his shoulder. He begins to walk. And then the Vitala speaks. The creature begins telling a story. The story builds, accumulates, grows complicated in the way that stories about human beings always do. And at the end of the story, the Vitala poses a question. Who is most at fault? Who acted with the greatest virtue? Who bears the greater responsibility? If the king knows the answer but stays silent, his head will explode into 1,000 pieces. If he speaks, the Vitala will fly back to the tree. This is the trap. This is the beautiful, precise, and deeply intentional trap at the heart of the Vetala Panchavimshati, the 25 Pales of the Vetala, one of the most beloved and structurally ingenious story cycles in world literature. The king is wise. He always knows the answer. And because he is wise, he cannot pretend that he does not. The moment he opens his mouth, the Vetala vanishes, and he must begin again. He walks back through the cremation ground. He takes the body from the tree. He flings it over his shoulder. The Vetala tells another story. 24 times this cycle repeats. 24 stories, 24 riddles, 24 escapes. The king of Ujjain, the son of valor, the man who defeated foreign armies and established a calendar, walks through a cremation ground in the dark, night after night, carrying a corpse, and cannot catch a ghost. The comedy of this predicament is not accidental. It is, in fact, the point. The Vetala tales are doing something philosophically intricate. They are showing that the highest quality a king can possess, genuine, active, incorruptible wisdom, is also the quality that most exposes him to perpetual labor. The king who does not know the answers could carry the Vetala to the tantric in a single night. It is the king who knows them, who cannot hold his tongue in the face of a moral puzzle, who is condemned to the beautiful Sisyphean work of beginning again and again and again. Wisdom is not a destination. It is a discipline, and the Vetala is its relentless teacher. It is worth noting that in the oldest surviving recensions of the cycle, Kshemendra's Brihat Katamanjari and Somadeva's Katasarit Sagara, the king who walks through the cremation ground is named Trivikramasena, not Vikramaditya. The identification with the king of Ujjain developed later as the tradition was transmitted and revised. That this shift occurred, that the most demanding moral curriculum in Sanskrit story literature eventually drew the tradition's most celebrated name toward itself, as if the stories chose their own rightful protagonist, is itself part of what the cycle tells us. The framework was compelling enough to attract the greatest king name available, because only that name seemed adequate to what the stories were asking of their hero. The stories themselves range across the full spectrum of human moral complexity. One tale involves a young woman, her husband, her father-in-law, and a question about whose grief at a death is most profound. Another involves a series of men whose self-sacrifice is so extreme that the question becomes not who was most brave, but who was most foolish. There are questions about competing loyalties, about the obligations of different kinds of love, about whether an act done from selfish motives can still produce virtuous outcomes. The Vitala does not pose easy questions. There are no simple villains in its stories, no uncomplicated heroes. Every tale ends in a tangle of competing claims, and the king must cut through the tangle with the precision of a surgeon who knows exactly which thread to pull.
What this structure encodes is a very specific theory of justice. The ideal ruler in this tradition is not someone who applies a rulebook mechanically or who defers to precedent because it is easier than thinking. He is someone who can hold the full complexity of a human situation in his mind, weigh each competing claim with equal seriousness, and arrive at a judgment that is both defensible and deeply felt. The Vitala, by posing ever more complex scenarios, is training the king in the essential skill of rulership, the ability to see clearly when everything is obscured, to reason soundly when emotion would prefer a simpler answer, and to commit to judgment even when the judgment carries personal cost. The Vitala, by posing ever more complex scenarios, is training the king in the essential skill of rulership, the ability to see clearly when everything is obscured, to reason soundly when emotion would prefer a simpler answer, and to commit to judgment even when the judgment carries personal cost. The Bhavishya Purana offers a striking cosmological framing for this entire enterprise. According to that ancient and much revised text, the Vitala was not an accidental encounter or a random supernatural hazard. The goddess Parvati herself created it to protect Vikramaditya and instruct him through riddles. The instrument of death, the creature that inhabits corpses, that haunts cremation grounds, that most people would flee from in terror, was in fact an agent of divine education. The king who was willing to walk alone into the cremation ground, who was brave enough to pick up the body, and wise enough to answer every question correctly, was not merely a man proving his courage. He was a man being prepared. The Vitala's victuals were the curriculum. The cremation ground was the classroom. The moment of revelation at the end of the cycle throws everything that preceded it into new light. When the Vitala at last poses a question that silences even Vikramaditya, a riddle whose answer truly eludes him, the spirit reveals that it has been withholding something crucial. The tantric who commissioned the king to retrieve the Vitala did not have benign intentions. His plan was to use both the king and the Vitala as sacrificial offerings to gain supreme supernatural power, to destroy the two forces whose combined virtue and knowledge stood between him and absolute dominion. The Vitala, now finally secured in the king's custody, tells Vikramaditya exactly what must be done. When the tantric performs his ritual and instructs the king to bow, Vikramaditya should strike first and kill him. This reversal is the moral crown of the entire cycle. The figure the king was asked to capture turns out to be the figure most necessary to his survival. The creature the king feared turns out to be the creature that saves him. The task that seemed like a service to a holy man turns out to have been a trap set by a villain wearing the costume of holiness. And the king who persevered through 24 nights of failure and frustration is the king who, on the 25th night, is prepared for precisely this moment. Because all those nights of answering riddles have sharpened his judgment to the point where he can act decisively when action is required and when hesitation would mean death. When the Vitala then offers Vikramaditya a boon, the king's response is, in its own way, the final riddle of the cycle. He asks only that the stories be remembered, that those who know them prosper, and that no calamity befall those who recite them. He does not ask for immortality or power or vengeance on those who wronged him. He asks for the preservation of the stories themselves, which is to say, for the preservation of the moral knowledge the stories encode. The Simhasana Dwatrimsika, the 32 Tales of the Throne, known more popularly as the Singhasan Bhatisi, approaches the same moral universe from a completely different angle.
Where the Vitala cycle places Vikramaditya at the center and tests his wisdom directly, the throne tales operate through his absence. Vikramaditya is already dead when the throne cycle begins. It is the Paramara king Bhoja who discovers the ancient throne hidden in a mound in the middle of a field. The description itself is described with a detail that captures the essence of what the throne represents. The farmer who owned the field was observed to be unusually generous whenever he climbed the mound, giving freely and without calculation. When he came down, he returned to his ordinary habits, cautious, careful, unexceptional. Bhoja, intrigued by this mysterious transformation, had the mound excavated. Inside it, buried and preserved across the centuries, was the throne of Vikramaditya. The throne was generating generosity simply through proximity, shaping the behavior of anyone who came near it, even through the earth. The king's virtue had not diminished with his death. It was still active, still transforming.
The tradition does not simply present the throne as a given, however. It explains why it exists and why it is adorned with 32 celestial figures. And that explanation is itself a perfect demonstration of the quality the throne was built to honor. Indra once summoned Vikramaditya to adjudicate a competition between two apsaras, the celestial dancers Urvasi and Ramba, each of whom believed herself the greater performer. Vikramaditya's method of judgment was invisible to the contestants. Before the dance began, he placed a live scorpion inside each woman's flower bouquet without telling either of them. Ramba, when her scorpion stirred against her hand, startled and threw her bouquet to the ground. Urvasi's absorption in her performance was so complete that the scorpion in her bouquet, agitated at first by her movement, then gradually drawn into stillness, fell asleep without her ever losing the thread of what she was doing. Vikramaditya declared Urvasi the superior dancer. Indra, moved both by the verdict and by the design of the test, which had measured depth of concentration rather than visible skill under observation, gifted Vikramaditya the throne, adorned with 32 apsara statues as living witness to the judgment. The structure of this test is the same structure at work in the Vitala cycle. A hidden stimulus, unknown to the subject, reveals the real quality rather than the performed quality. The scorpion measured what lay beneath the spectacle. The throne was not awarded for military achievements or acts of religious generosity. It was awarded for the capacity to design truth-finding in such a way that truth actually emerges, to see what others cannot see, and to remain still when everyone else reacts. The origin of the throne and the logic of the Vitala are, at root, expressions of the same epistemology. When Bhoja attempted to ascend the throne, one of the 32 statues that adorned it came to life. These were apsaras who had been cursed and turned to stone, and whose release from their curse depended on serving a king whose virtue truly matched that of Vikramaditya. Each statue that came to life issued the same challenge. You may sit on this throne only if your magnanimity equals what this tale reveals about the king whose throne it was. The legend names each of the 32 apsaras individually: Ratnamanjiri, Chitralekha, Chandrakala, Kamkandala, Lilavati, Ravibhama among them, each a distinct celestial personality, each holding within herself a different story from Vikramaditya's reign. The precision matters. The throne is not guarded by an abstract force of virtue. It is guarded by 32 individual testimonies, 32 specific moments from a specific life, each one presented by a being of divine origin who witnessed it or knows it intimately. Truth, in this tradition, is not a generality. It is particular. It is concrete. It is the story of what actually happened on a specific day in the court of Ujjain, when the king made a specific choice that revealed the specific quality of his character. The tales the apsaras tell range across the full range of what a king can be called upon to give. In some stories, Vikramaditya gives away his kingdom, his treasury, his own body.
In others, he descends in disguise among the people to understand their suffering directly. In still others, he absorbs humiliation from those who do not know who he is and endures it without complaint, because the quality of his justice cannot depend on whether he is recognized as the king.
After each apsara tells her story, Bhoja acknowledges that he has not yet demonstrated a comparable virtue. This acknowledgement is not a failure. It is the quality the throne is waiting to see. A king who could listen to 32 stories about another king's greatness and each time honestly say, "I have not done this," possesses the rarest of royal virtues, the capacity for genuine humility in the face of genuine excellence. When the 32nd Apsara has spoken, the statues collectively release their grip on the throne. Bhoja's humility has satisfied a condition that no amount of royal accomplishment could have let. He is allowed to ascend because he understood, fully and without resentment, that the throne belonged first to someone greater than himself.
The structural opposition between the two cycles, which ancient commentators identified explicitly, is one of the most elegant things about the Vikramaditya literary tradition. In the Riddle tales, Vikramaditya is present and active, the central figure of every night's ordeal, but the individual stories are entirely disconnected from his life. He is the judge, the listener, the moral intelligence through which the tales pass. In the throne tales, he is absent, dead for centuries before the stories begin, and yet every individual story is directly about him, a specific memory from his actual reign. One cycle uses the king as a vessel through which other people's moral dilemmas are processed. The other cycle uses other people as vessels through which the king's own moral achievement is preserved and transmitted. Together, they create something like a complete account of what the Vikramaditya tradition believes a king is for: to exercise wise judgment on behalf of others, and to provide, through the example of his own life, a standard that others can aspire toward, even after he is gone.
The legend of Vikramaditya and the planet Saturn extends this moral logic into the cosmic register. It has been performed for generations in Yakshagana, a traditional Kannada dance drama form combining music, elaborate costuming, and improvised dialogue performed overnight on outdoor stages, which gives some measure of how deeply the Saturn story embedded itself in the living performance culture of southern India. When the king mockingly dismisses Saturn as merely a harbinger of misery at a court gathering, the planet, present at the assembly in disguise, warns him that even Shiva and the demon king Ravana could not withstand its gaze. What follows is the full weight of the Sade Sati, the 7.5-year planetary period, falling on the king without mercy. He is thrown from a magical horse, robbed of his jewels, accused of theft, stripped of his hands and feet, and reduced to labor in the distant city of Tamalinda, a man without name, rank, or limbs. Even at that depth of deprivation, something that cannot be taken away remains. A princess named Padmavati, daughter of Tamalinda's king, hears music drifting through the night, the limbless stranger at the oil press singing Raga Deepak, the ancient raga of light, with such total absorption that candles ignite in its wake. She follows the music to its source and chooses to marry the unknown man because she recognizes in his voice something no title could announce. That the raga of light is specifically the one that causes light to appear is not incidental. These stories work the way the scorpion in Urvasy's bouquet works, meaning embedded in structure, the thing itself demonstrating the principle it embodies.
When Vikramaditya is finally restored, his limbs returned, his identity revealed, his former accusers prostrating themselves before him, the boon he asks of Saturn mirrors the boon he asked of the Vatala. "Do not make others suffer as I have suffered." The cremation ground, the buried throne, and Tamalinda are, in this sense, the same location, approached from different directions, each a place where the ordinary markers of power and status have been stripped away, leaving only what the person is underneath.
What survives in each case is the same: the king who cannot hold his tongue in the face of a moral puzzle, who sings the raga of light in the dark without knowing who is listening, who acknowledges freely that someone before him was greater. Not a man exercising kingship from a position of power, but a quality that holds when power is entirely gone. And if that was the standard, if this was what the name Vikramaditya was meant to invoke, why did so many kings in subsequent centuries reach for that name, knowing they could not meet it? What does it say about a dynasty or a conqueror or an empire that, even in the knowledge of their own imperfection, they wanted to be measured against this light?
Chapter 5. The Undying Title.
In Europe, the title Caesar survived its bearer by more than a millennium. Long after the last Julian had died, and the Roman Republic had dissolved into empire, and the empire itself had fragmented into successor states, rulers who had nothing to do with Rome, German princes, Russian czars, Ottoman sultans, still reached for the name because of what it implied: supreme, legitimate authority, the right to organize the known world. The name Alexander accomplished something similar across Persia and Central Asia, where Iskandar became a byword for world-conquering genius, invoked by kings whose lineages bore no relation to the Argead dynasty and who had never set foot in Macedonia. Scholars studying the Vikramaditya tradition have noted the parallel directly. The title became the South Asian equivalent of Caesar or Alexander, not a personal name, but a political vessel, a container into which successive generations poured their own ambitions and their own need for legitimacy.
The question this chapter asks is a practical one. Why? What was it about this particular name, attached to a figure whose historical existence remains unverifiable, whose dates and dynasty cannot be established with certainty, that made it worth claiming across 15 centuries and across dynasties as different from one another as the Buddhist Guptas, the Jain Chalukyas, and the Mughal emperors? The answer has less to do with the name's prestige than with what claiming the name required. Not just power, but a demonstrated commitment to the virtues the name represented. Rulers who called themselves Vikramaditya were not simply borrowing a prestigious label. They were accepting an obligation. They did not need the title to be powerful. They wanted it because power alone was never quite enough. Power can coerce. It cannot, by itself, legitimate. And legitimacy, the sense among one's subjects that one's rule is not merely unavoidable but right, that it represents something more than the successful application of force, is what separates a king from a warlord.
The name carried specific freight. To claim it was to claim that you had done what Vikramaditya had done: driven out foreign oppressors, presided over a court of exceptional learning, delivered justice to ordinary people, protected the learned and the sacred rather than exploiting them. Dynasties across the subcontinent traced their lineage back to Vikramaditya, and the assertion of blood descent was a common legitimizing strategy. But those genealogical claims worked only insofar as the king in question also performed the associated virtues. Bloodline without performance was empty. A dynasty could assert descent from Vikramaditya, but if its kings did not visibly embody the tradition's requirements, the assertion became a liability rather than an asset, a standard they had publicly claimed and conspicuously failed to meet. What made the tradition remarkable was the inverse. Performance could substitute for bloodline. A man born into no royal lineage who had driven out foreign rulers, assembled exceptional scholars, and delivered justice to those who came before him, could reach for the name just as plausibly as an ancient dynasty's heir. The title was not inert. It demanded something in return. And the fact that it demanded something is precisely what made it worth having. The earliest king for whom the record is unambiguous is Chandragupta II of the Gupta Empire. He did not invent the name's prestige. The name already carried resonance. But he was the first ruler to formally attach it to himself in the surviving epigraphic record. And in doing so, he established the template that later claimants would follow: military victory over a foreign power, patronage of learning, Ujjain as the symbolic center. Every subsequent king who called himself Vikramaditya was measuring his own rule against a standard that had already been set, in durable material form, by a predecessor.
What is perhaps most striking about the Vikramaditya tradition is not that great emperors claimed it. Powerful rulers reaching for prestigious titles is unremarkable. What is striking is that minor lords, vassal clans, rulers of limited territory and limited means, reached for it too, and reached for it as their primary organizing identity. The Gutas of Karnataka controlled a modest territory and ruled as vassals under larger dynasties rather than in their own right. Yet they named their kings Vikramaditya, organized their lineage claims around the Vikramaditya connection, and framed their entire dynastic identity in relation to the legend. The question worth sitting with is not whether the genealogical claim was credible, it almost certainly was not, but what the claim did. It placed a vassal lord within a narrative of legitimate kingship that transcended his actual power. It was not a lie so much as an aspiration encoded in stone. We are the kind of people who produce Vikramadytyas. Even we, in our small kingdom, understand what righteous rule requires. If even a minor vassal clan reorganized its entire identity around this name, the implication is significant. The name meant something not just at the apex of political power, but throughout the political order.
The Chalukya dynasty of the Deccan, which produced two kings who bore the name directly, offers a different register of the claim. Vikramaditya I, who ruled in the 7th century, inherited a dynasty that had been struck hard by its enemies. His father's reign had ended in catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Pallavas, and the Chalukya position in the Deccan was precarious when he came to power. What he did with that inheritance was understood in specifically Vikramaditya terms. He rebuilt what his father's defeat had shattered. The name was not given to him at birth. It was given to him because his career had warranted it, because, in the estimation of his court and his contemporaries, he had performed the required role.
His descendant, Vikramaditya II, who ruled in the 8th century, offers the most vivid illustration of how a king could perform the Vikramaditya identity rather than merely claim it. He captured Kanchipuram, the great Pallava capital, the richest city in southern India, not once but 3 times. Each capture was a demonstration of military supremacy, and each time he left the city's temples and institutions intact. This was not militarily necessary. Kanchipuram's wealth was enormous and accessible. The decision to refrain from plundering it was a political and moral statement. I am not here to extract, I am here to rule. He issued grants to the local institutions whose city he had taken, donations to the temples and monasteries of a place he could have treated as a conquered territory. He left behind a Kannada language inscription on the back of a pillar at the Kailasanatha temple, the great Pallava monument built by his enemies, recording his donations to the very institution that represented his adversaries' religious patronage. The placement alone is a statement. Where a record of triumph might have been expected, there is a record of generosity. He was performing the Vikramaditya virtues in the most visible possible venue, at the center of the world he had just conquered, in a language that marked his own cultural identity rather than his enemies'. He wanted it known not just that he had won, but how he had won, and what he had chosen not to do with the winning.
Not every record of Vikramaditya is celebratory. The Sanjan copperplate of the Rashtrakuta king Amogavarsha I deploys the name not as praise, but as a hostile point of comparison. Vikramaditya was so thoroughly the established standard that criticizing a rival by his failures relative to that standard was understood as the sharpest possible insult. The comparison was meant to diminish. It ended up demonstrating that no one in this period thought the name beneath notice. You cannot weaponize a reputation you consider negligible. His descendant, Govinda IV, returned to the subject in later inscriptions with considerably more elaboration. He praised Vikramaditya's generosity and valor, acknowledging the tradition's force, conceding the core of the reputation, and then accused him of behaving cruelly toward his own brother, of violating his brother's wife, of propitiating vampires.
The accusations are specific, personal, and carefully framed to undermine the legend from within. Not to deny that Vikramaditya was great, but to insist that greatness was entangled with crime. A king whose reputation requires this level of argument, from a dynasty with every reason to focus on its own achievements, generations after the fact, is a king whose presence in the cultural memory is extraordinarily tenacious. The Rashtrakutas engaged with Vikramaditya across multiple generations and could not stop. Even their hostility was a form of acknowledgement. The most elaborate and deliberate performance of the Vikramaditya identity in the historical record belongs to Vikramaditya VI, who ruled the Western Chalukya Empire from approximately 1076 to 1126. He renamed his era the Vikrama era, replacing the established Shaka calendar with a new dating system organized around his own reign. He assembled a court of exceptional scholars and poets and commissioned works that would not merely describe his achievements, but situate them within the longest available story of righteous kingship. The poet Bilhana, who wrote the Vikramankadeva Charita, compared Vikramaditya VI's rule to Ramarajya, the reign of Rama, the ideal of perfectly just governance that Hindu political thought had long held as the highest standard a king could approximate. To say a king's rule resembles Ramarajya is to say that under him the world as it should be and the world as it is have come into alignment. Vijnaneshwara, the scholar who composed the Mitakshara, one of the foundational texts of Hindu jurisprudence, a work that would shape legal thinking across the subcontinent for centuries, wrote of his patron, "A king like Vikramarka is neither to be seen nor heard of." Not the best of his generation, or the best in living memory, but a phenomenon without precedent in the record of human witness. Vikramaditya VI had read the template with unusual care. He furnished the name with the institutional and intellectual apparatus, the scholars, the legal reforms, the renamed calendar, the commissioned texts that made the claim credible to anyone paying attention. The tradition's reach across religious lines is demonstrated nowhere more clearly than in the case of Kumarapala, the Chalukya king, who ruled Gujarat from 1143 to 1172. Kumarapala was a committed Jain, a patron of Jain scholarship and temple building, a ruler who shaped policy around Jain principles of nonviolence. He had no inherent reason to reach for a template most closely associated with Hindu notions of ideal kingship. He reached for it anyway. Gujarati Jain writers of his period depicted their king explicitly as a new Vikramaditya, filling the template with Jain values, generous, nonviolent, devoted to learning, and finding that it accommodated the inflection without contradiction. The episode demonstrates the tradition's fundamental flexibility. The Vikramaditya name could be claimed by a Buddhist Gupta emperor, by Hindu Chalukya kings, by a Jain Gujarati ruler, each finding it capacious enough to hold their own conception of ideal kingship. It demanded certain performances, patronage, justice, military competence, the protection of learning, but was largely silent on the theological content of the king's convictions. It was, in the deepest sense, a political rather than a sectarian standard.
The most dramatic single episode in the history of the Vikramaditya claim is also the most compressed. In October of 1556, Hemo, born into a family of merchants, risen through administrative talent and military competence to command the armies of the Sur Empire, drove Mughal forces from Delhi and entered the city in triumph. He proclaimed himself Vikramaditya. The claim was audacious precisely because it stripped away every credential except the one the tradition actually required. He had driven out foreign rulers, restored sovereignty over the imperial capital, demonstrated the military and organizational capacity that the name demanded. By the tradition's own internal logic, the claim was not absurd. It was, in its way, exact. It lasted 29 days. At the Second Battle of Panipat, an arrow struck him in the eye. He collapsed in his howdah. His troops broke. He was captured and executed.
You do not mobilize an empire to erase a pretender you consider negligible. The proclamation of Vikramaditya at Delhi was treated as an existential challenge. Even in its failure, it demonstrates the weight the name still carried in the 16th century. Himu had read the tradition correctly. He had simply run out of time.
In 1556, Akbar's forces destroyed the man who had proclaimed himself Vikramaditya in Delhi. Within a few decades, Akbar would reach for the same tradition, not by taking the name directly, but by assembling the institutional form the tradition most famously represented. The Navaratnas, the 9 gems of the court, whose combined genius was said to define the cultural apex of Vikramaditya's reign, and whose construction is examined in Chapter 3, were the most celebrated feature of the legend. Akbar assembled his own court of 9 exceptional figures: Birbal, Abul Fadl, Faizi, Tansen, and 5 others whose names and talents would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with what a great court was supposed to look like. Rather than claiming the Vikramaditya name, which, given what had just happened to Himu, would have carried awkward associations, Akbar claimed the structure. The 9 gems without the explicit name was still the 9 gems, recognizable to anyone familiar with the tradition, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. He performed the claim without making it. In this, he may have been the most skillful appropriator of all, the ruler who most successfully absorbed a tradition while leaving no documentary record of having reached for it. The claim was not exhausted by kings and dynasties. It was available to modern nation-states, organizing their official relationship to time itself.
In 2013, the Indian Navy commissioned its largest and most powerful vessel and named it INS Vikramaditya. The reasoning was explicit. The most capable ship in the fleet, the one with the widest reach, should carry the name of the king whose purpose, in legend, was to project justice across the land. The ship's motto, "Strike far, strike sure," sits in a slightly different register from the legend's ethical framing, but the tension may be more apparent than real. Vikramaditya defeated the Shakas. He struck far, and he struck sure. The justice he represented was not passive. It was backed by the capacity to destroy what needed destroying, to reach across distance and impose consequences. The aircraft carrier's motto may be a more honest reading of the military dimension of the tradition than the purely ethical framings that have sometimes accompanied the name, a reminder that righteous kingship and the capacity for decisive violence were never, in this tradition, understood as opposites. There is a final observation the pattern collectively demands. The historical Vikramaditya, the man from whom all these claims ultimately derive, is, by the standards of conventional historiography, a shadow. We cannot pin him down. The evidence is ambiguous, the sources conflicted, and a serious historian has to acknowledge that Vikramaditya the individual may be more legend than person, as Chapter 1 has examined without resolving.
And yet his influence on verifiable history is extraordinary. Chandragupta II, whose coins survive in museums. Vikramaditya II, whose inscription remains visible at the Kailasanatha temple in Kanchipuram. Vikramaditya VI, whose Vikramata era reorganized the dating system of a Deccan empire. Kumarapala, whose Jain scholars encoded the legend in Gujarati literature. Himu, who staked his empire on the name and was executed 29 days later. Akbar, who built the structure without speaking the name. The nation of Nepal, whose government stamps the name on legal documents. The Indian Navy, whose most powerful ship bears it today.
These are not shadows. These are the hard facts of history, and they all orbit a center that history cannot quite illuminate. The figure who may not have existed has been more durably influential than most rulers whose existence is beyond question. This is not an accident. It is the point. A historical figure accumulates defeats, embarrassments, cruelties, and contradictions. The record catches all of it. A legendary figure, one whose historicity remains uncertain, whose story has been shaped entirely by what later tradition wanted him to represent, accumulates none of those things. He can be exactly what each age needs him to be.
Every age that has needed a standard for what kingship should look like has found that this name, precisely because it is not nailed down to a specific person's specific failures, can hold that standard without strain. The title is undying not because any particular king successfully and permanently claimed it, but because the thing it points toward, a ruler who is genuinely worthy of rule, who understands that power without virtue is merely force with better armor, is one that no ruler has ever fully achieved, and no age has ever stopped needing.
Vikramaditya may never be fully located in history, but that uncertainty is precisely his power. He is not a man who ruled and died. He is a standard that every age has inherited and struggled to meet. A reminder that valor without wisdom is merely violence, and wisdom without courage is merely philosophy. The calendar still counts his years. The navy still carries his name. Dynasties across 15 centuries measured their legitimacy against his legend. What this tells us ultimately is that the stories a civilization chooses to keep are not decorations around the edges of its history. They are the architecture of its values, the invisible framework within which real decisions, real wars, and real acts of justice are made. The question Vikramaditya poses to every age is the same question the Vetala posed in the cremation ground. Do you know the right answer? And if you do, can you live with what answering it costs you? Thank you for listening.